Alright guys, so running it back fresh off of part 1, we have part 2 of Ash's ultimate teams for every series, now covering the modern era from Best Wishes to Journeys. For those coming in blind without knowing the lore, I recommend visiting part 1 to fully grasp how the whole shebang works, but just to summarize, this will be ultimate teams for Ash spanning across all the other series in a way that sorta makes sense for both the narrative and the time period it's in. Because while I do love an ace team, it admittedly is pretty redundant and oversaturated in my opinion. And trigger warning, just like in part 1, there will be the unfortunate chirping of a smoke detector across the whole video, and my response to changing the batteries this time around is no. But I'm pretty sure that's all that needs to be said, so without stalling any longer, let's get started. And the first two right off the bat will be Crocodile and Pig Knight. I was really considering adding Ashwa because in my eyes, he was the main starter. But then I remembered, he was pretty mid in battle, so might as well go with the one that was somewhat above mid. Ash's Unova Mines can be a real pickle to scale just for how hard the show tried to balance an overcrowded roster of mines, but looking at Pig Knight, it was one of the few that seemingly was consistently good. Was used for over half the gyms and would always at least get a win before knocking out since becoming a Pig Knight. Crocodile is considered the unanimous ace of Unova solely for how well it was treated compared to the others, but Pig Knight is practically the second in command behind him. Even a subcategory of fans might say he was the actual ace, or even a potential one had he grew a little stronger. But a small minority, or hypotheticals, doesn't mean much when you have the big crook. Crocodile's impressiveness has always been a mystery to me, just for how I'm not sure whether it was an accident or just purely intentional. It wasn't to a Charizard, Sceptile, or even an Infernape level degree, but he was the only one on the team that this series was not playing around with. Like, fun fact, Crocodile as Crocodile, if you didn't know, is undefeated. Plus, with his former rivalry with Pikachu, it was what made Crocodile a hype addition to Ash's team in the first place, befitting his last capture of the region. But one person we can't afford to forget for this series is Charizard. While not as epic as beating up legendaries or taking down long-term rivals this time around, he still managed to maintain that presence he usually had. From the rivalry with Dragonite to that one time he beat up that random Ninetales. If anything, the series may be my favorite usage of Charizard because he felt like a part of the team despite being a temporarily guest. Like, that kinship with Pig Knight was something cool that I never thought I needed. But the next person I wanted to add was Bayleef, mainly because I wanted to follow the nostalgic yet unique approach Black and White went with. No doubt her personality would fit right in with Unova's more lighthearted style, and while a bit obsolete in terms of feats, Bayleef was still impressive enough to convince me she'll still... And while a bit obsolete in terms of feats, Bayleef was still impressive enough to convince me she'll still be relevant. And then there's the last person on a team, which is once again, Gible. Think, remember how Phanpy had somewhat notable potential, then came back in the very next series? Imagine if Gible did the same. Remember how Phanpy eventually came back to evolve to be a Donphan? Imagine if Gible evolved into a Gabite. Come on, you gotta see what I'm cooking here. In all honesty, I'm one of the few that actually think Gible is perfectly fine as is. I've been indifferent about Gabite, and Lord forbid, if it evolved into a Garchomp, I'll cry abyss fiction. But you know, if it came back during Black and White and evolved into just Gabite, that might go pretty hard, I can't hold you. But with everything considered, I think that's a good spot to wrap up Best Wishes. Now pushing it to XY, and while there's one ginormous elephant in the room, I really wanted to dive into the second most relevant selection within Ash's XY team. In all honesty, out of Talonflame, Noivern, Hawlucha, and Goodra, it really could be anyone of your choosing. I mean, I really wouldn't know why you'd choose any of the last two, but whatever agenda you want to push, it can make sense. Until the second Kalos member for this team I chose was Hawlucha. To do the process of elimination, Noivern and Goodra choking in the Kalos League permanently has me in doubt of their combat abilities for the rest of my life. And so it fell down to Talonflame and Hawlucha to step up since they're the only ones who pretty much somewhat locked in other than Pikachu and Greninja throughout their entire run. But I guess I chose Hawlucha because it felt cooler. Like, no, seriously, that's it. I meet ride Talonflame any other day of the week, but Hawlucha just had something. That being the aesthetic, the sauce. But like I said in the beginning, it doesn't matter because the rest of the team are background characters compared to the real Kalos Mine. The star, the shining hero, Ash Greninja. This guy ran the show. Like, it had a chokehold on the anime like no other. It's not my favorite, but I can definitely see why it is for others. But for real, the coolest thing about it for me was the release. I don't care what you have to say. Maybe it's something that I have to rewatch fully to understand, but sacrificing its role as an Ashmon to play a hero for an entire region? Like, dog, there's lore behind this, so there's levels to this. It's sort of how in a game or a show or something to where you have a busted power and you pretty much have it tucked away for balancing reasons. If anything, that fact there alone makes Greninja some of Ash's most interesting and captivating Pokemon. But yeah, no more dragging it. The next guy we have lined up is Krookodile. Back when Ash brought back his old Pokemon, there's usually that one from the previous series that popped off. And out of the Unova team, it just made sense that he'd be that guy. I don't think I've ever established the timeline of the Ultimate teams, if there even is one in the first place, but whether it's the Kalos League or the Champion League, I promise he's hitting them with the clothesline, hitting them with the rocks, hitting them with the claw. Also, for a narrative bonus, Krookodile's addition is a way to show a redemption for Unova Ash, other than XY and his team simply being the cooler, stronger variant. But the other Pokemon I thought that would be cool to bring back would be Sceptile. If Ash ever brought back his old Pokemon back, the show would most definitely spread some of that Gen 3 representation. And just imagining XY, whether it's the action or the story, Sceptile just seems to be the perfect fit. More than DP, on paper at least. We're all too familiar with its games, so everything else that needs to be said can honestly just be copy and pasted from earlier to here. And so the last guy we got is Gliscor. And dude, this choice was such a last minute decision. The whole time I was trying to find a way to fit Buizel into the mix, solely for how Buizel would have loved the high stakes battle environment, along with how cool it would have looked in the XY style. But there's one problem. Buizel kinda sucks. Normally, I have no qualms in adding any underdeveloped Pokemon, but only because said Pokemon I include have potential in the underdog sense. Buizel, on the other hand, doesn't have that, but you know who does? The battle with Paul in the Sinnoh League was a true testament of Gliscor's redemption, and though it was short-lived, XY would be the perfect way to expand upon that. Also, its battle style would be really nice in the series' style, but I guess with everything here, that closes out the XY team. For Sun and Moon, this had to be the hardest team to come up with. The standard procedure is that these teams are heavily influenced by two factors: older gen remakes and the previous series itself. The problem, though, is that Alola is very isolated. It's practically the main gimmick and aesthetic of the region. Alola Ash can function very well without the influence of XY, which mainly leaves the relevant Pokemon to bring back being Kanto Pokemon. And so when we can go with is Bulbasaur. Aesthetically, quite literally any of the Pokemon Ash has in Kanto fits into Sun and Moon, excluding the rather two weaker options. But if the rest are viable, why not go with Charizard, someone iconically included in an Ultimate Team since the beginning of time? Well, Bulbasaur simply had the vibes. The vibes. No, like seriously, this one shot was what convinced me to do this whole style of Ultimate Teams in the first place. And I'd hate to play a game of compare and contrast, but trust me when I say Bulbasaur is equally as viable. The last time the two fought together on the same team, it was because Bulbasaur defeated an opponent stronger than Charizard. I thought on with how after a certain point, Bulbasaur along with Squirtle eventually grew to be treated as equals to Charizard, both in portrayal and feats. I assure you, for a lineup of Ash's greatest in both narrative and power, the Seed will hit just as hard as the Flame. But the second person on this list is gonna be their third radio in a row, and it's Krookodile. Just like Bulbasaur, I picked Krookodile for the vibes. The vibes. And like I said before with how he was presented in Unova, there should be no doubt in their skills. But also the second reason I chose Krookodile had to do with the most extremely obscure Pokemon fact I've ever come across in my life. and that is the existence of Professor Burnett, and how she doesn't originate from Sun and Moon, but from a 3DS application dating back all the way to Gen 5? Yeah, in my 10.5+ years of being a Pokemon fan, this news was the most shell-shocking. And in honor of that fact, I decided a Unova Pokemon would be a much-needed inclusion. Next up though, I think it's finally time to get to the Alolan Pokemon now. And the two that made its way here are both Lycanroc and Incineroar. For all of these teams so far, it's always mandatory that the ace Pokemon of the series makes the cut. And while most people accept that Lycanroc is the ace, there's still some shaky doubt regarding that. So let's break down as to why he's deserving of the title. Firstly, they fall under the Special One category, with having the unique form exclusive to only Ash. Second, they were the first to have a major long-running story with a Pokemon, and of the main rival of all people. Lastly, they were the one that allowed Ash to win his first main league and even champion title. The battle with Kukui acts more as a real champion title match, but the fact that Lycanroc is the first to achieve this monumental feat is something they wouldn't have just given to anybody. These all alone present Lycanroc as the main mon other than Pikachu, but the second one running in the race is Incineroar, no doubt. While not as present, there's still a little sub fanbase that still thinks they're the real ace. They're the main one other than Lycanroc to have major story beats, and depending on who you ask, it was greater and stronger in the case of the Fire Cat. And I too agree with the idea that conquering Kukui's Incineroar is a much more grandiose feat in terms of the Poke rivalry. Last thing is that they already have a rivalry with Lycanroc too, so ace or no ace, these two are no doubt the top two hitters. The last guy is rather underwhelming for the whole lineup I had presented, but the final one is Tauros. When thinking of Kanto Pokemon that make a cool comeback in Alola, Tauros was one of the main ones that popped up first, even more favorable to make it to the list than any of the Kanto starters. I'd love to elaborate more, but it's mainly because of the main Poke Ride, and using one that Ash actually owns sounds perfectly in line with what the show would do as a nod. But that's basically it for the Sun and Moon team. But actually, the last thing I wanted to do was try an alternate team. I know I said I'd only do this for AG, but this team surprisingly ended up looking extremely good. Even though the team I just covered is the preferred one in all my heart. First, we'll keep Lycanroc and Crocodile, but there's the option to swap Incineroar for Rowlet. This is entirely interchangeable, but don't forget that Rowlet is one of the core members that can hold their weight. If you think it's the weak link because it's unevolved, just stay out of scaling. Then we'll include Snorlax, whose presence will feel just as home in Alola, whether it's comedy or battles. Lastly is Noivern, for which XY was really hard to incorporate, but if there's one Pokemon that can get a redemption arc, it's this guy, who didn't really get a chance to spread its wings in the first rodeo. Just looking at this team sort of makes me feel this is the closer to the canon, but I still love the first one so much. But I don't know, let me know which one's better. And we finally get to cover the last team. So for Pokemon Journeys, the first half of this lineup is Pikachu, Lucario, and Gengar. I always considered this half the main representatives of the team entirely, solely for carrying all the three main battle mechanics at the time. But even outside of the battle mechanics, they're the most developed as characters. The others aren't bad per se, but they were noticeably the weaker half, both in battles and in character. You have Lucario being the ultimate Ash Pokemon out to the Pikachu due to the aura, a spiritual power Ash always had, but its utilization always slipped from his grasp until his last series. Then you also have Gengar, who wasn't some destined partnership like some others, but put in the elbow grease to make him one of the shining stars through sheer hard work. But who else could find their way to be a shining star on the team? Well, the first one I thought prudent to add was Infernape. Again, we're cycling back to the remake promotion cycle, and funny enough, this guy was the only mon in Sinnoh that they gave time to shine. Even better, he'd fit in perfectly. Like, not only is he a friend and mentor to Gengar, but also seems to be really vibing with Lucario's fighting style, likely forming a bond and rivalry between the two. And the next person I wanted to add was was Rowlet, who I also think can be swapped for any of the available Alolamons, but in this case, this route is much more preferable. Like, you can choose Incineroar for the opportunity for it to show off its evolution in battle, or Melmetal for the chance it gain its Gigantamax. The reason to add Rowlet is solely for the team dynamic. Normally there's the comic relief in the team, and that's where Rowlet comes in. And then the last Pokemon I'm adding might be my favorite pick out of the guest stars, for which it's Pidgeot. As some of you may or may not know or remember, Pidgeot finally came back under Ash's ownership in the latter's very last episode. And this has been stuck in my mind because, like, for the longest, they were the most flat jobber Ashmon in history. But now that they're back in the roster, we can see what they can do after the long disappearance, and even get glimpses of a possible new and improved personality. And you see, one of Journeys' main strengths was the past coming back together for the present. Infernape in any Alolan Pokemon are the past, while Lucario and Gengar act as the present, the succeeding generation. But even more interesting, like any other series ending with Ash going to a new adventure, Pidgeot could act as the future. And what better way to end off Ash's last and final team? But finally, that wraps everything up. Like last time, feel free to share your thoughts. Which is better between part 1 and 2, which Pokemon got justice, which got done dirty, whatever you feel like. And lastly, both parts will eventually be combined into one in the long distant future. It's not super relevant news, but consider it the definitive edition that'll do both parts justice, rather than the rushed and separated mess that was these two. But yeah, that's pretty much all I got for now. Yep.